with Personhood USA to start state affiliates. And we're very honored and very blessed to have them with us. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Brenda. And I wanted to just briefly go over those same three things. Tell you four things about myself. I'm a national board member with National Right to Life, and I have the privilege of calling friends some of the most famous and revered pro-life heroes of our day. Mildred Jeffries, whom the Lord just called home last year, and we're Minelli Gray, who I spoke with just 2 months ago, a week before the Lord called her home. She's the founder of the March for Life in Washington, D.C. for the last 40 years. Jack Wilkie, first president of National Right to Life, is a good friend. And these are heroes that have been at it for 40 years. A generation has passed since abortion became legalized in America. As a national board member for National Right to Life, I'm promoting the objective of National Right to Life, which is a human life amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We call it, for ease of sake, the Personhood Amendment. A Personhood Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has been the goal of the pro-life movement since its inception. And we were working towards that. Somewhere along the way, we lost our way. And this has been a controversial issue of late, but it's something that, as you're going to see historically, has resurfaced over and over in the pro-life movement. The issue of personhood and the strategy to accomplish our objective, which is a constitutional amendment. I'm also the president of Georgia Right to Life, as Brenda stated, and as such, we're the state. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we started, there was only 3% of our legislature that was pro-life. Now, we define pro-life a little more rigidly than most. We do not allow a politician who claims to be pro-life, who has in his position statement a belief that it should be legal to execute a class of human life based on their manner of conception. We're the only one of 3 states in the nation as National Right to Life affiliates that take what is called by the press an extremist position on the position of life. But we're consistent, we're principled in our approach, and I want to tell you it's been the most pragmatic and prudential thing we could have ever chosen to do. Georgia Right to Life Georgia is the only state in the nation that can claim that all 9 of its statewide elected officials, from governor to lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, all the way down public service commissioner, every single statewide elected official is not only pro-life, but they're pro-life without exception. Georgia law has no exceptions for rape and incest in any of our law. We went from a 3% legislature that was defining pro-life to where today, last week, by God's grace, an article by the Associated Press named us as the special interest group responsible for bringing a super majority Republican to the House of Representatives and to the Georgia Senate. First time in 130 years. The right to life issue in Georgia is successful. It's a winning strategy. And we don't need to back up, stoop to conquer, or be ashamed of taking a principled position in the public square. Now, I'm also, as of 2 weeks ago, the National Field Director for Personhood USA. And that means that we want to see personhood affiliates started in every state that will promote a non-compromising objective in their political endorsements. Towards the end, that we get personhood compliant legislation at a state level, and ultimately, whether by the ballot process and ballot initiative or by the legislative process, we see a human life amendment, a personhood amendment at the state level for every state constitution. And then, once we have the requisite number of 2/3, we will move to a national referendum. That has been the goal of the pro-life movement and is, again, what we are aiming for in the 21st century. I have one other distinction, probably by God's grace, the one that I'm the most delighted in, and that is that I am the grandfather to 26 grandkids. And children are a blessing, and we've been blessed, my wife and I, that we have seen our children also inherit that love and desire and embrace the fact that children are a blessing. Now, having said that, what I want to do is introduce as well the Pillars of Personhood seminar. It's, you will see this slide throughout, and we'll pause whenever this slide comes up to take questions, comments, answer any concern you have on facts or perhaps something you didn't understand. So feel free to lift your hands and we'll take those questions from the audience. The Pillars of Personhood are in fact modeled after this government building. This is not a temple. It is after the style of Greek architecture, but it's a government building. And what we're doing is using it as representative of the pillars of understanding that we want to impart around the issue and subject of personhood. Obviously, these pillars of understanding are what we consider essential for us to know where we've been. In fact, the first 3 pillars are historical. It's talking about the past, the pro-life movement of the past, and then we move to the 4th pillar, which is the pro-life movement of today, and the last 2 are the pro-life movement that we're looking and anticipating as a future. To do so, I want to start off with a historical episode not so long ago. This is in my grandfather's day. These were headlines in his lifetime. Starting with Hadamar, Germany. Hadamar was a quaint town in Germany in the 1920s. Let me set the stage historically for you. Germany had just been defeated in World War I. They were suffering and reeling under the reparations, fiscal reparations that the Allied victors had placed upon Germany to pay for the cost of the war. They were in depression. It was a time of hyperinflation. And I want to remind you that this is 13 years prior to Hitler coming to power. In fact, Hitler was in a jail somewhere in Germany writing his book, Mein Kampf, at the time of this picture. Hadamar, Germany in the 1920s. And what you're looking at is the result of a new public policy based on a new science, a science known as the science of eugenics. Funded by the Rockefeller Foundation of America, German scientists were trained in the eugenic science of good birth. Eu meaning good, genics meaning beginning, the good beginning, as opposed to a bad beginning. And so, under a new public policy of austerity where healthcare was rationed, we find that a new policy was being advocated. Alfred Hoch, Karl Vining wrote a book and were able to convince the German government that the killing of useless eaters was justified. Now, useless eaters were narrowly defined. These were children born with fetal anomalies, chromosomal anomalies. And so there was a clear public opinion that these children couldn't live long after birth by diagnosis. Therefore, let's give them not only, since they have not had a good birth, let's give them a good death. And that's where we get the term euthanasia, good death. And so they were determined to be superfluous to the culture, unnecessary. Buses, school buses, would come around to the hospitals in 1920, and they would remove these children born with chromosomal anomalies and cart them to the facility there in Hadamar, where they were burned as medical waste. Now, these children were diagnosed with the following conditions. Children born with anencephaly, that's where you're missing your brain. You have only a brain stem, no higher functions. Children with Potter syndrome, where their kidneys were born outside their body and was a guaranteed death sentence, not long after birth. Trisomy 19, 20, and 21. Now, they didn't know it as such back then. They knew it as Down syndrome or some of the other trisomy anomalies. Extra chromosomes, they weren't quite up to that level of science yet. The incurably ill, they were part of the bus group that were picked up. Now, once you expanded to the incurably ill, these were children, not adults, whose condition was incompatible with life. Now, we call this Germany's slippery slope. The reason we call it that is because one thing in compromising human life led to another, led to a greater, led to the mentally challenged being included in the useless eater category. Public policy in 1920 was not to harm the mentally challenged. But as time progressed and it became acceptable to kill infants with these congenital defects, then it became acceptable to apply the same remedy to those who obviously did not enjoy a good birth from the mental capacity standpoint. Then the blind, the deaf, and dumb children were then picked up at their homes and delivered to Hadamar and other of the euthanasia centers around, ostensibly for the best treatment that society could provide, treatment for their condition, where they were promised under a socialized system of medicine to receive the best care the state could give them, only to find 6 weeks later that their child had succumbed to one of 6 deadly illnesses and were sent, the parents, a urn of ashes with a death certificate for the cause of death. It was then extended later into the 1939 and 1940 to the half-breeds. Genetic science was reaching the epitome of German policy, and racial purity was high on the agenda. Anybody that was a half-breed was also delivered over to these buses. And of course, we know that the undesirables were the Jews who were labeled non-human. And at a certain point in German history, if you're not human, then there is no justification needed to kill something not human. In 1939, up to 100 victims a day arrived in these school buses. They were falsely told to disrobe for medical examination. They were sent before a physician, and instead of examining them, they were assigned one of 60 fatal diseases. And a different colored Band-Aid was placed on each child or adult. It sorted them into 3 groups: those that were just outright killed. Then there were those who were killed and their brains were removed for scientific research. And then there were those that were killed and their gold teeth were recovered as bullion. Now, this was the epitome of medical science in 1939. By 1941, Hadamar, the hospital at Hadamar, the medical facility, celebrated its 10,000th euthanasia, or good killing, good death. Now, at this point, the parents became aware of the atrocity, because their child would be deaf or dumb and would come back with some kind of other diagnosis and an urn that obviously wasn't their remains. And the public outcry was so great that Adolf Hitler shut down what was then called the T4 Actian program. The elderly, the unfit, were all classified by this time as useless eaters. Anyone with any level of dependency upon the state for medical care was being euthanized, and it led to a wholesale outcry of the people. And Hitler, bowing to public opinion, shut down the public T4 Actian program. So where was German science going to turn in order to continue their human research? Well, it was to the concentration camps that they turned. By 1941, the concentration camps at Dachau and Birkenwald were in full swing. And it was there that the German scientists performed human experimentation. In this particular picture, a Jewish individual, a prisoner, was dressed in the full regalia of a German pilot. One that was dressed in the same coats and leggings that would accompany a pilot flying over the North Sea. They were trying to emulate a downed pilot in the North Sea. You can see the ice cubes in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, keeping the tank cold, ice cold. Minutes would go by before the object or subject was senseless, where he would then be removed, and they would remove his brain for immediate examination while the subject was still alive. Now, these forms of heinous experimentation were quite common because the anesthesia was reserved for the troops on the front line. So any of the scientific experiments that they did were generally without anesthesia of any sort. And I won't go into any lurid details, but of course the most famous, infamous doctor or scientist was Joseph Mengele. Dr. Mengele had one specialty, and that was genetic research on twins. And so as the Jewish twins came out of the rail cars onto the ramps, he was there to funnel them into his study group. And it was not things that would be considered relevant studies. I mean, even common sense would tell you at our level of understanding that these things were fruitless, but it didn't stop him. He would slice open the sides of twins and then conjoin them together to see if he could form conjoined twins, Siamese twins, and what the effect would be on children, twins that are identical, but were now joined together bodily. There's all kinds of lurid stories of amputation and mutilation that were done on these children. And he is the only Nazi scientist to escape justice. He died of old age in Paraguay in 1979 because Israel and the United States could not find him. In a massive manhunt, he was able to elude justice and died of old age. Now, these are terrible things. In 1945, trial in Nuremberg took place, and Allied prosecutor Thomas Dodd, holding the trophy of one of the camps, scientific trophies of a shrunken head. Studying the ancient practices of the headhunters in the South Pacific, the German scientists were able to replicate the heinous practice of shrinking human heads. What does that have to do with science? It shows you the level of decadence that an entire scientific community, as well as a culture, can in fact fall to when they remove from their public consciousness the sanctity of life and human dignity. This doctor's trial at Nuremberg included a number of nurses that were at Hadamar, and the least sentence passed on the nurses at Hadamar was 25 years of hard labor. 16 of the doctors were charged and found guilty, and 7 were executed by hanging. Scientists pursuing human knowledge illicitly, according to the World Court. How many of you have a blog? Anybody have a blog? Okay. This is a term, Godwin's law, that you may be familiar with. Excuse me, as a blogger, Godwin observed something. And of course, this definition comes from the source of all wisdom, Wikipedia. He said that given enough time in any online discussion, regardless of the scope or the topic, somebody always likens the other side to Adolf Hitler or the Nazis. And the understood implication is the first one to do that loses automatically the argument. It's an automatic default. As soon as you start likening your opponent in a discussion or a blog to Hitler or the Nazis, you automatically lose. Fortunately, Wikipedia goes on to make one more observation, that Godwin's law itself can be flawed, wrong, or misapplied when the arguments and comparisons are actually appropriate. Actually appropriate. I was testifying in a House committee 6 months ago on a fetal pain bill, and I read from Time magazine, and I never used the N-word Nazi. I never referred to Adolf Hitler. I only referred to liberal Germany of the 1920s. And I was later assaulted for having insulted doctors and called them Nazis. The liberalization of medical science in Germany came to be equated with Nazism, is true. Let's take a look at where we are today. You tell me whether or not the analogy is apropos. This is from Discover magazine, May 2012, just a few months ago. The organ harvest proceeded, front cover, over the objections of the anesthesiologist who saw the brain-dead donor react to the scalpel. What's happening in organ donation today is because of the dearth of human organs and the competitiveness with which the medical community goes after, in a very aggressive manner, procuring these abortions, you have what's called a cadaveric donation. Now, we all know cadavers. Are cadavers alive or are cadavers dead? Well, we think they're dead, but that's not the scientific meaning of the term. A cadaveric donation is a donation of someone who is brain dead by some measure of determination. They're not even clear or in agreement on what those criteria are. There are no hard, fast rules on being brain dead. In fact, I was testifying before another House committee 2 years ago on this entire subject when one of the House members, the elected representatives listening to my testimony, interrupted and said, I was brain dead. I suffered a stroke 2 years ago. My God-fearing wife, praise God for her, he said, the doctors came to her and said that I was brain dead, that I suffered massive damage during my stroke, and that I was a candidate for cadaveric donation. My lungs, my heart, which have to be taken from a living human body, must be taken from a living human body. And in fact, when they take the heart, they rip it out, cut it out, beating. And the death certificate says death by heart failure. Death by heart failure. He said that if it hadn't been for her faith and insistence, I wouldn't be here today. doctors are not foolproof. They're human. They make errors. And in this particular case, it was a horrific error. And so much so, it's so common that Discover magazine made it a matter of front cover May 2012. The editor got into a lot of trouble for doing this. So I don't even know if he's still working for them, but it was quite controversial that he even brought it up. Enough testimony to say that the aggressive nature of organ donation today is actually akin to human vivisection. What about human experimentation without informed consent? That's what the Nazi doctors were prosecuted for, among other things, was doing human experimentation without the informed consent of the patient. Now, I'm in a drug trial for a medical condition. I volunteered for it. I signed paperwork saying I know what the risks are. I have exercised informed consent for my medical condition. That is a minimum standard that came out of the Nazi doctors' trial in Nuremberg in 1945. It was called the Nuremberg Code. Most of the countries of the earth signed on to it, including the state of California, but not the United States of America. We do not abide by the requirement that any medical experiment on human life must be with a good end and expectation in sight. You can't just be casting about, sewing twins together to see what will come of it. You have to have some good anticipation of a positive outcome. And number two, you have to do it with the informed consent of the individual. Well, if what you're looking at is a human zygote, a human embryo at a 4-cell stage, that human embryo is human and has rights. What you're looking at is a human-animal hybrid. It is a chimera created by Cornell University, where they had taken the gene of an Australian jellyfish that glows in the dark, and at the 4-cell stage, introduced it into a human embryo to see if that human embryo will grow. And every successive cellular division and day that goes by, will it retain the genetic changes that they introduced at an early stage? And the answer is yes. And at the end of 14 days, they killed this child, this human child that was, at 14 days, glowing in the dark. Now, there was an outcry, an obvious outcry, and the National Institute of Health was appealed to. And they said that the Cornell work would not be classified as gene therapy and need a federal review because a test tube embryo is not considered a person under the regulations. No protection in the law for a human embryo. Let's fast forward. This year, Georgia Capitol, 2012, we were actually attempting to pass a 20-week ban on abortion that was personhood compliant throughout its tenure in the House. And as it went over to the Senate, there was a group of senators who caved to the Medical Association of Georgia. The Medical Association of Georgia promoted an amendment to a personhood compliant piece of legislation that said this. Basically, we'll give you a 20-week ban on abortion, but you've got to give us some exceptions. And here's what those exceptions are. If the fetus is anencephalic, or diagnosis of Potter syndrome, congenital or chromosomal anomaly that is made that is incompatible with life. We heard that before? That was pulled directly out of the public policy manual of Germany of the 1920s. Here's the face of anencephaly. Problem is, anencephaly is got, as any disease, varying degrees. A doctor can diagnose anencephaly but he can't diagnose with any degree of specificity how developed that case of anencephaly is. And many of them are compatible with life. We had a couple in our church that gave hospice care to children with anencephaly. And I have held those children through the years as they developed, recognizing faces, smiling. Celebrated the third year with Sapphire and the second birthday with Ruby. These were children who, if they died with dignity, love, and care, afforded to all human children. Are we anywhere near the stage in Germany where we have buses that are going to be pulling up to our medical facilities? You tell me. The parallel is pretty clear, and I don't think I would run afoul of Gottman's law in this particular case. What is it that will cause a culture to lose their respect for human life, and in such a manner as to ultimately be engaged in the most heinous and degenerate of human experimentation? Can it happen to us? Will it happen to us? Those are the questions that we have to deliberate and talk about in the whole issue of the legal recognition of personhood. What we're trying to do is to not allow the erosion of our culture so that the respect for life absolutely collapses, as it did in the case of the foundation on the backside of this structure being eroded. But what we do have to understand is that this is not just about saving babies. Now let me say that in a less forceful, more compassionate way. We're all in the Bright Life movement because we want to see babies saved. We want to see an end to abortion. But that's not what's needed in the 21st century. It's not just about ballot initiatives. It's not just about overturning Roe v. Wade. It's about reestablishing the respect for human life and human dignity that was lost to Germany in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And did they suffer the judgment of God? Twice. And the second time was pretty significant destruction in World War II. Do you think that that's an accident? This was the most heinous form of human science ever practiced and allowed in modern history. And they were, in fact, an example of the sleeping justice and judgment of God, which is the foundation of this throne. Personhood USA's purpose is the recognition and protection of the God-given, unalienable right to life of all innocent human life. Human beings as legal persons at every stage of their biological development. We base this on a biblical passage in Genesis 1:27, and then God said, "Let us make man in our likeness, our image, after our likeness." And we call this the doctrine of Imago Dei. That's where Western culture and civilization through the ages have gotten their understanding of human dignity and sanctity of life. We are going to be referring to it as the personhood principle, where, beginning in Genesis, the book of beginnings, we have God's revelation that there is something special about mankind. Any questions, comments on the historical analogy between where we are today and where we were in Germany in 1920? All right.
Was Hook, is he the same fellow that Hoche, the German medical source that RU-46 came from?
Oh?
Hoche.
I'm not sure. Not sure. I'll have to check on that. It's an interesting point, though. All right. Personhood. v. Wade, 1973. Justice Blackmun, writing for the majority opinion in Roe, highlighted personhood when he said that if the suggestion of personhood of the preborn is established the abortion rights case, of course it collapses. For the fetus's right to life is then guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. The personhood of the preborn child is the single point on which the entire debate stands. Are you aware that this next month we are anticipating a response from a court case that we filed with the U.S. Supreme Court requesting cert on the issue of personhood? And if they allow the case to be heard, it will be the first time since 1973 that we will be able to actually argue on a basis of the personhood of the preborn. So we're very excited. Be in prayer about that. That is something that we are looking forward to and could in fact overturn Roe v. Wade. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and that's happened. Roe v. Wade has been overturned. Is our pro-life movement finished? I mean, if we're just in it to save babies, we have now overturned Roe. It's gone back to the states. Each individual state can make up its own mind and actually ban and outlaw abortion at that level. Does that mean that the movement is finished? Well, we will see a pretty serious decrease in giving and level of participation, I'm sure. But what about the elderly? Do you know that they're being called post-persons? In a ration healthcare system where there are limited resources, rationing is a requirement. There are a finite level of resources, and there has to be some way to decide who receives those resources and who doesn't. And under the Obamacare plan, there is what's called a quality of life year score. You're actually scored on your medical condition. If you have a limp, that's a half a point off. If you have a serious condition like diabetes, like I do, my score is very low. And so your score will determine what procedures and medical care at a critical level you will receive. Now, who decides that? Well, there's a 15-member panel. One of the senior members of that panel, appointed by President Obama, is a fellow by the name of Peter Singer. Peter Singer, from Australia, bioethicist, now at Princeton University, says that his own mother probably wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for his caregiving sister. So he believes in a utilitarian application to the medical services, and we have found in examining the Obamacare pretty exclusively that there is, in fact, a clause in there that will not allow me to use my own life savings, my own money, to buy medical service from the hospital when I am in critical care. That the hospital and the doctors will not be allowed to sell me those services without losing their access to Medicare payment. So that's a little known aspect of Obamacare. Go to National Right to Life's Medical Center, PAL Center for Medical Ethics, and they'll give you the chapter and the verse and the documentation on all of this. The elderly are post-persons. Human embryos, there's over 500,000 human embryos frozen in a cryopreserved state as a result of excess embryos produced through in vitro fertility practices. They're labeled as pre-persons. Georgia is the only state in the nation, there may be one other now, that has allowed for embryo adoption, where parental rights are terminated prior to the transfer of that human embryo to an adoptive mother. That's a novel concept, but what do we do to rescue those who are perishing in a cryopreserved state? Right now, the oldest child born of frozen embryo is one that had been frozen for 20 years. Its twin brother was graduating from college when this child was born. A whole host of ethical issues are raised, and this is something that we as the Right to Life, Sanctity of Life movement should be involved in. We've already talked about an anencephalic infant. They're being considered, or at least were attempted to be considered in a recent Georgia law as non-persons. If you're a non-person, you can be executed. You can be killed under the law. Human-animal hybrids, as we saw with the human child and the jellyfish gene, glow-in-the-dark, are unpersons. And then we have terms such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That's where they, in an IVF procedure, fertilize 20 eggs, examine those embryos that have grown for a while, a day, and see which ones under the microscope appear the healthiest, or maybe have some kind of genetic good birth or bad birth. And they will decide on the basis of eugenics whether or not to allow those children to go forward in the process of being frozen. All the others are killed. Assisted suicide, of course, we talked about as euthanasia, a good death. Is our movement finished? No, it's not. It is not finished, and it is something that we are very definitely concerned with. And that's what this Pillars of Personhood display is all about. We're attempting to turn the dialogue, or the debate, into dialogue. And what we're going to ask you to do, as we engage the student body tomorrow with this display, is that you find common ground. You'll see here my goddaughter, Brittany Nels, who is actually talking with somebody at a display, finding common ground with them. In other words, somebody comes up yelling and screaming, all verbally upset, emotionally distraught. You just simply say, I see that this has disturbed you quite a bit. Can I ask why? Well, that's too graphic. Well, this isn't, and you can say you're right. I agree with you. This is too graphic. Is it something we shouldn't ever talk about? Try to turn the dialogue, the debate, into a dialogue. There will be no shouting or that type of thing as we look to engage the culture. The purpose of this Pillars of Personhood training is to train high school and college kids to educate the church, to impact the nation. Because without a shift in public opinion, you can't have a law or even a human life amendment to the Constitution. Think about it. Can anybody tell me in our history a constitutional amendment that was reversed because public opinion didn't support it? Anybody? Prohibition. Prohibition was reversed because it didn't enjoy the long-standing support of public opinion. It's not enough just to ram through a law or to get a court decision. We have to engage the culture, and we have to shift public opinion. This has been a large part of the success in Georgia as we have educated the church, educated the public, educated the electorate. Education, 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 before we ever attempt to shift political action to legislative objective. This is the order that it has to go in. And that is a longer-term process, but it's one that we have to understand if we're going to be successful in the long term. Otherwise, we as a culture will experience the same collapse. And it is something that we cannot afford to do. Now, before we can even get into the pillars of understanding, it's clear that we've got to talk about the foundation. And we make no bones at Personhood USA, Georgia Right to Life. We, of all pro-life groups, are somewhat unique in this. We're faith-based. We're Bible-based. We make no apology for that. We engage the culture because our faith requires it. It requires to engage along the lines of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we find the truth of human dignity, human worth in the Bible. And that, as I've said before, is through this illustration. You see the mirror there. You have God, the imago, the image of God, God himself. And he has created a reflection of that image in man. It's not exactly the same because we're not God. but his communicable attributes of compassion, love, gentleness, long-suffering, along with his communicable attributes of justice, judgment. These are things that we can reflect the character of God in to a certain degree, a finite degree. And in that sense, we are a reflection of the image of God. What are other things included in the image of God? Well, free will. He's given us an ability to choose. But he's also given us the capacity to know him. A capacity to know God and be known by God is unique among all of Earth's creation in that we enjoy a specialness. Now, Wesley Smith, ProLife bioethicist, doesn't use any Christian terms. He calls this speciesism, or being somewhat set apart or special as a species. Human uniqueness. He attempts to convey the same thing through secular terms and doesn't approach any of the arguments or reasoning through biblical foundation. We, on the other hand, are very clear about where our foundation lies. Now, you know from your Sunday school lessons what happened. The fall. Sin entered the world. And the image of God was not lost. It was just simply corrupted. And you can see in this image in the mirror that it is no longer left to right, it's right to left now. There are lower changes that came about in our ability to reflect the perfect character of God in a communicable sense. The Apostle James says that it's not just believers who have the image of God. It's all men, everywhere, are made in the likeness of God. All of humanity enjoys this set-apartness, this specialness. The term is holiness, to be sanctified. And that's where we get the word sanctity of life, the set-apartness of human life and existence created in the image of God. You've heard the term sanctity of life. This is where it comes from. Perhaps the greatest argument at all biblically for respect and inherent human dignity is the incarnation itself. And contrary to popular opinion, Jesus did not come to earth as a lion. He came to earth as a small human baby, taking on flesh, human flesh, that he might redeem us and we could enjoy him forever. We know the song, Holy, 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 God in three persons. There's personhood in the Godhead. That's another aspect of being created in the image of God. We have singular personhood. There are three persons in the Godhead. And we are known by God in the womb, as was Jeremiah and those passages that most of us know in Isaiah. And the Lord now said, He who formed me from the womb to be his servant. God knew us. And he knew all our days, when yet there was not one of them. The perfect example of personhood biblically is John the Baptist, New Testament example. John the Baptist was known by God in the womb, named by God, called by God and set apart to ministry, and filled by God with the Holy Spirit while in his mother's womb. The passage tells us there in Luke. John the Baptist, perfect example of personhood. And if you don't know this passage, this is probably the most foundational passage in the Bible. For you formed my inward parts, it says the psalmist in 139. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. What beautiful prose. What a beautiful concept. That God's superintending our knitting together while yet unborn. There are 51 pro-life passages in Scripture.